Good morning and good afternoon to you wherever you may be as you tune in today. And thank you for joining us. For those who have joined us for the first time, these conversations are focused on HR and workplace topics with a lens of talent management, leadership, workplace culture, learning and development, all the fun stuff. I'm Sonya Sepahban, CEO of OurOffice, where we help busy HR professionals and people leaders navigate the current environment and be the most effective at what they do. We have a suite of time-saving products and services to help these leaders and the workforce at large. Today, I'm super excited to be joined by my friend and a real HR thought leader, Ian Ziskin, who I have had the pleasure of collaborating with in a new book about grief and loss and how we can learn and grow and become better leaders through it all. So welcome, Ian.
Great to be with you, Sonia. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. Such a pleasure to have this conversation with you. Before we get into the conversation, I want to mention that this session is approved for SHRM recertification credits, and the activity code will be shared later in the session, and it is also recorded. So, Ian, it's great to have you here. When we were planning this conversation, we could not have imagined how timely it would be. In a world today that's racked by wars, mass shootings, job cuts, climate threats, and shifting economies, and more, nearly everyone today is either directly wrestling with or at least observing some form of loss and grief. But to begin, I'm sure our audience would love to first get to know you better. So, can you please share a few highlights of your personal and professional life for our audience to get to know you a bit?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for the opportunity to do that. I've been in the HR and leadership game now for about 43 years. My career has basically been a couple of chunks, I guess, along the ways. First spent about 28 years or so working for large companies, primarily in human resources. Toward the latter part of my corporate life, I was the chief HR officer for two companies, most recently a company called Northrop Grumman. So Sonia and I go back a long way, working not only at Northrop Grumman together, but also at TRW prior to that, many, many years ago. So a few decades back for sure. And you've been a huge part of my corporate life. Now you're also a huge part of my coaching and consulting life. So about 15 years ago, more entrepreneurial direction I took was launching my own coaching and consulting business called EXec EXcel Group, which is a portfolio of a variety of things, a lot of senior level coaching, a lot of leadership development, some boards of directors and advisory boards. But along the way, have written 5 books, and this book that we're going to be talking about today, Lives Lost and Leadership Found, is the most recent of those that actually literally just came out on Monday of this week, so 2 days ago. So it's an exciting time to be talking about this topic, and I appreciate the opportunity to do that.
Oh, absolutely. And I will say, we do go back a long time. When I joined TRW in 1997, I date myself. I was a toddler when I joined, and you took me and many of the leaders under your wing. I was a very young executive, and I remember many a conversation and learning moments from you in your office and elsewhere. When you were playing the guitar at one of our offsites, that was actually a lesson learned because I was so head down, as a woman executive in a aerospace and defense, highly male-dominated sector. I never thought of myself as a woman, but still, I was a little bit, cautious about what goes around me, and I would just head down and working really hard. And when I saw that, it really made an impact on me. I will say there's several moments like that, which I remember, and there were really moments of learning what a great leader really looks like.
I
So
really
thank you for
appreciate
that.
that. Thank you so
Um,
much for saying that. Well, one other thing, by the way, just to build on what you're saying, we might be the poster children in a way for, the value of and importance of relationships, over an extended period of time and building a network. And maintaining those relationships, which actually, as we get into the discussion about the book, came
Mhm.
out to be one of the more important themes and lessons learned. So we're kind of, living that as, longtime friends and business colleagues.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And this will come out as well as many other important, I think, themes of the book. But let's start from the beginning. So, your book, Lives Lost and Leadership Found, grew out of very personal stories of loss and growth. What inspired you to take such a vulnerable step in sharing these stories publicly, I think is of great interest as we start to do this. I mean, it's not a topic that has been, treated in a leadership book or in a business environment, frankly. I think to some extent it's been avoided, maybe.
Right.
Uh, and so what inspires you to do this?
Yeah, the origins of the book go back a few years now to 2023 when both my brother
Mm,
and then my mother passed away within about 6 months of each other. So in my brother's case, he was 4.5 years younger than me, 60 at the time, went into the hospital thinking that he might be having a stroke, but almost immediately discovered that he had some brain tumors, and they suspected that he would have tumors in other parts of his body, which turned out to be true. So the diagnosis pretty quickly, unfortunately, was metastatic cancer, meaning that it had spread throughout his body, and literally passed away within 8 days of going into the hospital. So it was very sudden, very unexpected, and of course, anybody experiencing that kind of loss, it rocks you back a bit. And then about 6 months later, my mother, who was 93, therefore, less shocking, that somebody that 93 would pass away. But I'm fond of using the expression, she was fine until she wasn't, because she was a relatively healthy 93-year-old who
mm,
ended up with stomach pains going into the hospital, and within hours passed away from cardiac arrest. Her whole body just, kind of shut down from what she was experiencing. So these two things happening in fairly rapid succession over a relatively short period of time really got me thinking about not only the loss and processing these two
mm,
losses, but also, is there anything positive that can be learned from this? What did they teach me during the course of their lives, and as they passed away? And were there any leadership and life lessons that could be found through these negative experiences? Then, of course, maybe me being me, I started thinking pretty quickly about, well, clearly I'm not the only person on the planet, who's ever lost a loved one. I wonder if other people not only have had the experience of loss, but spent time thinking about what they might have learned about life and leadership from losing somebody, special to them, and started reaching out to people in my network, including you, but, many others who, much to my positive surprise, were quite interested in contributing
mm.
stories to this book. So we can talk a little bit about more in a minute about what some of those stories revealed, but that actually became the impetus for writing this book, was losing my brother, then my mother, and then talking to other people about their experience with loss and trying to turn it into a book that would provide some learning and
Mm.
something positive out of, some very negative experiences that people had gone through.
Yeah, I will share from my own experience also when you uh, approached me, for potentially being part of this. I was really intrigued by the topic because, again, as I said earlier, I had not seen any leadership conversation about grief and how it impacts us and how we deal with it in the workplace. In fact, I remember when I lost my dad in 2005, um, I was hit with such a strong wave of sadness and profound loss that I had never experienced before, and was really, frankly, well beyond anything I had ever expected. I wasn't that close to my dad. He used to travel a lot. And but when it happened, and even though he was older and he had had some challenges in the last few years of his life, I just was devastated. And I couldn't come back to work for about 3 weeks. And then when I did, I remember sitting at my desk, on the top floor in Redondo Beach. You remember it?
I
Um,
do.
and a friend of ours, both you and I, and a colleague, Jeff Grant, was the first person that came into my office to say he was sorry for my loss and asked how I was. And as soon as he did that, very unexpectedly, I just started, crying again. And and he came over and hugged me, and it was so unexpected because, as you recall, in those days especially, um, I certainly didn't see that much, didn't show that much emotion, or I didn't expect to have to to ever show that kind of emotion. So when you asked to join you in this work, I really knew I just had to do it for me. And I knew that I'd discover things about myself and my relationship with my dad by collaborating on this book. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and I'm glad you did. Thank you.
So so let's talk about the stories, right? So as you gathered stories from so many leaders, and you layered in some research and neuroscience of it, what patterns first stood out most to you about how grief shapes us and ultimately us as humans and then as leaders? What are just a couple of things you could share with me? I was looking at the book yesterday, and it's a fabulous book. I think it's one of those that you can pick up and read different parts of it. I was almost going to say it's like a coffee table book because, people are worried about these days having time to read a book, but you could almost like read it just story by story. And
Right, right.
and then you
Well,
have the chapters where you discuss, some of these themes.
Well, one of the funny things, of course, about writing a book is that a lot of people say no one reads books anymore. So trying to write a book in a way that people can digest it in smaller, more digestible chunks probably does help. And I think for those who are listening, it's probably important to know that everything that we're talking about and are going to be talking about related to the book is not just Ian's view of the world. This was very intentionally a collaborative effort bringing in, well over 200, probably closer to 300 different voices from 35 essays being contributed to the book to some survey input from a very wide variety of different people to actually the lessons learned and the voices of the special somebodies, who've passed away, who obviously can't speak for themselves anymore, but they were represented by you and the other essay contributors, who told incredible stories. And to your question more directly, one of the more powerful things that became very obvious right from the very beginning was something that you were just alluding to a minute ago when you were telling your story about Jeff Grant coming into your office, which is most people don't really process grief very well, and they also don't acknowledge or speak about grief very well either. It's an uncomfortable experience for everybody involved. And while I think it's important that we acknowledge, the discomfort that goes along with it, one of the things that became very clear in putting this book together was the catharsis that a lot of people experienced by being able to talk about their lost loved one. And there's a quote that we have in the book by a woman by the name of Jamie Anderson, who's an author herself, who talks about the fact that grief is love with no place to go, and so
Mhm.
getting input from people through survey and certainly through the essays that they contributed in a certain way gave the love a place to go, and the ability for people to
Mhm.
process their grief by honoring somebody who was extremely important to them in their lives. So that was an important
Mhm.
theme that I wasn't necessarily expecting to see emerge. But there was also a lot of common themes in terms of life and leadership lessons that people had learned from lost loved ones. So if you think about, the crux of this book, basically in a nutshell, is life and leadership lessons learned through lost loved ones. And some of the more common themes, I'll just touch on a few and we can get into more detail if you'd like, were a lot of stories about courage and
Mm-hmm.
resilience, a lot of stories about compassion and relationships, and a lot of stories about curiosity and
Mm-hmm.
purpose. Those are probably the three most common threads that weaved throughout the entire book was life and leadership lessons learned about those three chunks of things.
Yeah, no, those are I could see that too, and that's how the book is organized about these different topics. And I will say that I think largely because I had been part of this experience of writing a chapter about my dad and what I learned from that now in retrospect, um, I was able to process the loss, a more recent loss, better. You talked about people are not good at processing loss. And I think it's like anything, right? It's like, why do we read philosophy books or different things? It's like these mental or emotional exercises where just like going to the gym prepares you better to run a marathon. You know, when you have these experiences and you reflect on things, both intellectually and emotionally, you're better prepared to process it the next time. So I lost my uncle who was very close to me, and in fact, in some ways, much closer to me than my dad because he was more present. He was always there with us. Like when my mom would always take us, skiing or on trips or whatever. And my uncle was always along to kind of help take care of the kids and everything
Right.
in my dad's absence. And he always said I was like a daughter to him, and we stayed very close until his passing last November. He too was, extremely, he was, he lived in Newport Beach, and he lived by the beach, and he used to, until 2, 3 years before he passed at about 80, 84 years old, he was like riding his bike, and he was quite, um, healthy, and but he had never gotten married. And so we were very close, but then the last 2, 3 years, all of a sudden, he got hit with several health challenges. And so up to the end, I was the one always going and visiting him and these things. So it was very difficult to lose him. And yet in many ways, more difficult on objective measures. But somehow I was able, of course, I'm a lot older now than when I lost my dad, but I was able to process it a lot better. And so I think these things are really important. So anyway, you talked about these key themes. Which of them do you feel is most urgent for leaders today? As leaders, we experience grief and loss ourselves, but our people do too, right? There's people in the workforce that come in every day with various forms of loss and grief. Um, what do you think is like, maybe a couple of most important urgent things for them to remember and maybe do something about it?
Yeah, I'll touch on that in a second, but I just want to pick up on one thing that you just said because your more recent experience of losing your uncle, and I'm sorry for your loss there,
Thank you.
actually does prove something that I think came up over and over again in the book, which is the ability to process these kinds of difficult things, not only loss of a loved one, but dealing with other significant changes in your
Hmm.
life is actually something that can be learned. You can
Mm,
actually learn from the experience and get better at it. It's like developing a muscle. And the neuroscience behind that, David Rock and Jeffrey Schwartz are two pretty well-known people in the neuro leadership space. For some people who may be listening, they have heard of them. They talk about this concept of change is pain and focus is power. And it turns out that change, all kinds of change, not just organizational change, but loss of a loved one, for example, very significant change, but it also creates very significant pain that has to be acknowledged. And the greater one's ability to focus intentionally on dealing with that type of change and difficulty actually gives you power and improves your ability to deal with the difficult aspects of things. And that's true not only in life, when you lose somebody important to you, but also in the practice of leadership. So to your question about, one of the more timely and relevant things that maybe we learned from
Mhm.
the book in today's environment, this whole emphasis on courage and resilience and dealing with some of the difficult things that are happening around us. There are all kinds of examples of people, who were special somebodies highlighted in the book, having to deal with situations where determination and sticking to the situation and fighting through obstacles and pushing back and bouncing back, from difficult circumstances and the willingness to show the resilience that's required in order to overcome difficult life experiences or, in some cases, leadership experiences, absolutely essential for being a successful leader in today's environment where there's so much difficult, crazy stuff happening in the world, most of which we do not control ourselves individually, but all of us are faced with dealing with those kinds of difficult circumstances and stopping and asking yourself, do I actually have the courage to stand up to it and face it? And then the resilience to actually deal with it. Now, there's one other, subtext to what I'm saying,
Mhm.
which is the importance of facing and dealing with reality, because we know from leading transformational change, but we also know from dealing with grief and loss that one of the most difficult things for any person, be they a leader or not, to deal with is the truth, the reality of the situation and what we're facing, as opposed to the way we prefer to see the world or to see the circumstance. You have to face into the reality of what you're dealing with in order to process it, work your way through it, pass through the grief, pass through the resistance or the reluctance to change, and then come out the other end as a stronger, better person and leader. So I think, of all the things that came through in the book, for me as the lead author, that was probably the single most important set of learnings to focus on.
That is so important, right, for leadership. When we think of great leaders, right, if you we think of back to anyone that we aspire to or have, that is like a constant, right? And I want to offer something that's one of the, you asked us to um, identify three key things that stood out, as lessons learned from our special somebodies, and one of my three is related directly to what you say. I mean, they're all interrelated, but one that is really related is when you face the truth, also in the face of truth and what's going on, to be uncompromising about our values. Um, my dad's, I think, strongest quality uh, was his integrity.
Yeah,
He put that above everything. He worked in the regions of the world where he was originally from, from Iran, um, where corruption and shortcuts were commonplace.
right,
He came to this country on a ship, and he was a brilliant student. He went to Harvard and was very shortly thereafter worked at some of the most sensitive programs in defense, in fact, in this country. And so when I ended up in aerospace and defense, kind of by chance, frankly, I aspired to be an engineer like my dad, but I didn't necessarily think I would, end up, especially in GNC, guidance, navigation, and control, where I was at NASA, and then after that, very related topics. Where one of his papers once came up, somebody reminded me, said, "Is this the same?" Because I use my maiden name as my last name always, and said, "Is this related to you?" And I'm like, "Yes, it's my dad." I was like astounding, but he went back for a few years at the request of the king at the time in Iran, and he just could not stand the corruption and the shortcuts. And as a kid, I used to hear it, and he never gave in, and not even an inch. And for that, he suffered some. But that literally saved his life in the middle of a revolution that happened in 1979. And they took a lot of people who were his colleagues, they actually literally executed them. And he was probably one of the very, very few people who was in some position of leadership and was not executed or jailed when he went back, because at the time he was with the UN and was in Geneva, but he decided to go back, despite the fact that I warned him, and I was very upset because I had just finished college, and I was like, Dad, you can't go there. They're going to kill you. And he said, no, my name is more important, and I haven't done anything wrong, and I'll go and I'll clear it. And so he went, and so there was a couple of years of a lot of uncertainty for us as a family as we were, watching this from afar. And he did okay. He went there. I mean, and now that's a dramatic, a very dramatic thing that hopefully doesn't happen to many people at all. But there's a lesson in that, right? I mean, everybody pays a price for compromising their values. And right now, there are a lot of opportunities for people to just let things slide or to go along with the flow, whichever side you're on. This is not a political conversation. Whichever side you're on, I don't think there's any safe zone anywhere anymore. And, you see something that's wrong, you see something that people are suffering unnecessarily. And if you don't say anything, if you're in a position where you could do something about it, or if just say even silent. I mean, all of those things are compromising one's leadership values that are about, leading people, ensuring their safety and well-being, and so on, especially those of us who are in charge of other groups of people and their livelihood and a lot of things like that. So I think, like you say, bottom line, facing the truth, and then also speaking the truth, and not compromising your values. I think in these days
Yeah, I mean,
is
there's a lot of examples throughout the book about these important lessons of aligning your own sense of purpose and values with, whatever you're facing, whether it's in a personal circumstance or in a professional circumstance. And I also know, many of your listeners are, HR people or other
yes.
leadership roles that people are playing. One way we didn't talk about this exactly this way in the book, but one way of expressing this that I think really hits home is, you have to decide whether you want to do your job or keep your job. If your main mission in life is to stay employed, you hide under your desk. You allow a lot of things to slip by that maybe shouldn't slip by, when doing your job may very well mean pushing back, saying no, standing up to people who want to do stupid or illegal or
Mm,
unethical kinds of things, and not allowing those things to occur, because you can always get another job, but it's really difficult
mm,
to replace your reputation and name and your own sense of values and purpose. Once
mm,
you compromise those and give those up, they're extremely difficult to get back. I think that's a really important, valuable lesson, not only from this book, but just from understanding the complexities of aligning purpose and values with how you actually act as a person and as a leader.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point about your reputation. I think it gets magnified when you think of reputation, or the brand, as we call it these days, right, of a company. It is so difficult to regain, to reset, uh, associate with um, uh, one grade. I mean, there's been studies done on this, that most of the workforce expects their leadership, their company, to take a position on certain things. And so uh, it's not, it's no longer acceptable. I mean, especially the younger generation, they just don't accept that leaders and their companies just stay kind of neutral, on the
Right.
sidelines of some issues. So you kind of have to just, you know, think very strategically, especially on boards that I know both you and I sit on boards. And, it's important in the boardroom to bring these things up. And a lot about our audience are CEOs and board members, or at least interact with board members. And it is so important to bring these things up at the highest level and say, what are we going to do? Are we going to say something or not? And be really thoughtful and think of that brand positioning that will be with you for years to come. I mean, people have very long memories, and people will be here, and the workforce will be here. Administrations and policies and things will come and go.
Well, just to reinforce what you're saying, one of the other really powerful lessons for me in writing this book was realizing that really the vast majority of people who were being talked about as special somebodies, who we lost, were ordinary people who lived ordinary lives and had ordinary kinds of jobs and died in what we might consider to be pretty ordinary ways. Now, I'm being a little obnoxious here and in the book too with overusing the word ordinary, but it's not intended to offend as much as it is to make a point, which is that, all of these individuals wouldn't have necessarily considered themselves to be leaders, and the people who were writing about them didn't necessarily think about these people as leaders until they actually sat down and started putting the story together of what did I learn from this person about life and leadership. And it turns out that all of these very ordinary but extremely extraordinary people had things to teach us about life and leadership, even though their job title, and their business card, might not have said, "Hey, I'm a leader." And I really think that's important for anybody who wants to read the book, for example, to think about, their position in life, no matter what job they have, career, what kind of work they do for a living, what age and stage of life they might be at. It's the influence that you can have by your actions and by your words and the way you conduct yourself in life and to some degree in death, that people will learn something of value from you about life and leadership. And it doesn't really matter whether you were thinking of yourself as a leader or not. That was actually a very powerful discovery in the
Mm.
book that I wasn't necessarily anticipating as we were putting it together.
Yeah, that is so such a good reminder to everyone, right? Regardless of where you are in the pecking order, as we say, right? And
Right.
and learning from it. I love what you said about, learning from those, and it's kind of how we started, right? When I was thanking you for the learning moments. Um, this, I will also say, just reminds me, was another lesson that I had shared in the book in my piece of it. This was absolutely my dad's superpower.
Mhm.
I learned from him that there's always something new to learn, especially, as I went on, from my team members. Um, he was so curious about everything. He started in electronics, he was an electronics engineer. He went on to, after, a couple of decades in missile defense and this kind of thing, where electronics was very important. He has pictures in a room full of light bulbs where the original computers were, the analog systems. And and then he went when he was asked to go back to Iran and serve there for a few years, and then he left again because he couldn't take it very much. Um, he was given very, high levels of responsibility in the oil business, because that was, of course, the big business there. So he
Right.
trained himself in all of that, and it just turned out I was in high school. I was going to the Tehran American School, and um, I was in this equivalent of an AP class in chemistry, in organic chemistry, which I actually got credits for at university. When I went to become a chemical engineer, I actually got credit for those high school courses, which was astounding to me. But anyway, as I was studying it, he was studying and working through some of the problems with me. of my organic chemistry, not because I was a nerd and I was a really good student. I didn't really need help, but he was very interested in that because he was in the soil business. He was trying to develop this mega model that would be win-win for what they call the North and the South, the developed countries and the underdeveloped countries, or developing countries, I should say. And so, what's the optimum price point? Because at that time he was also working with OPEC. Was what is the optimum price point where the consumers in the developed countries will will help them conserve more, and not just waste the resources, the natural resources, and then also for the sellers who happen to be mostly in the developing countries at that time anyway. U.S. now has large production also, but at that time it really was mostly the developing countries in the Middle East and elsewhere were the producers and where they would also benefit, right? So it was a win-win solution. So it was working on this big thing, and he thought that understanding the science behind the organic chemistry of it and the refining and all this stuff would be, he just wanted to really learn that, even though at his level, he really didn't need to. He had lots of engineers who could, crank the numbers and do the things that they needed to do for the efficiency of these processes and so on. But he really wanted to, and this always stayed with me. I don't know if you remember from when I was, but I've always took pride in, walking the line or going down to to whoever the junior engineer was, meeting every intern myself, even when I had organizations of thousands, that I was entrusted with or honored to serve, frankly. And it's just, I think there's something very important in that because it puts everybody on equal ground. Like I have a lot to learn from somebody who's on the line, a tech, because that gives me a deeper understanding of the issues of what we can, of the drivers, of the quality, of the price, of all things. And this idea of just learning, you can learn from everyone, anywhere, I think for a leader is a very unique ability because a lot of us get to the point where we think, oh, we know it all and we don't need any.
Well, I mean, your essay in the book was great for a variety of reasons, but one of the things that really stood out for me was the intellectual curiosity and passion for lifelong learning that your father had, which he very clearly instilled in you because if you look over the course of your career, doing all of the NASA stuff and the engineering stuff in the aerospace and defense industry and running businesses, and now being an entrepreneur, literally, founding your own company and business, all of these pursuits and many other things that you've been involved in cut across this pattern of lifelong learning and intellectual curiosity that in many ways seems to have started with your dad and the way that he conducted his life, but he didn't just talk about it, he actually demonstrated that to you in a number of ways that he lived his life. It's a great way of underscoring, if you think about 35 essays, every one of them is different in terms of the person featured and the kinds of things that they taught us, but every one of them is consistent in the sense that all of those people, lived their life in a way, conducted themselves in a way that taught really valuable lessons about life and leadership to the people who were around them. That was very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, isn't that astounding that there's all these lessons that maybe we weren't even really conscious of, but because of you, Ian, we became more aware of all of this. And I will add just one other thing about my dad, and I'm not trying to make this all about my dad, by the way. Somehow I didn't plan it this way at all, but it's like just coming out, is that his curiosity and this learning kind of thirst for learning extended to when at the last few years of his life when he had Alzheimer's, and he couldn't recognize anyone. I was the only one he always recognized to the very end, which was very surprising to all of us. But after he passed, my younger brother at his ceremony, he read something out of my dad's little journal. He kept a journal always, he was always taking notes. He had copious notes on everything. and his room was just his office, home office was like just all books, to the brim. My mom every so often would say, "Now we have to just make a pathway into this room, so we have to get rid of a few of these things." And and those days were always like we always knew that that was a day to stay away from that room, and they could just hash it out. But he had because he couldn't remember things, he was trying to figure out a world that he no longer remembered how the world actually worked. So he was trying to figure it out by, on his own and by learning from different things, like on a can of, canned fruit, like on the can, things that were said there. He was trying to understand that concept, when he couldn't remember anymore. And so anyway, these things, we do have some Q&A. So let me, by the way, um, ask you at least some of these things, but one of them is, how can leaders allow space for their own grief while still showing up for their teams? It's an excellent question.
Well, yeah, it is an excellent question. Also, something that I wasn't quite sure how it was going to, materialize as the book was coming together, but it did. And let me explain what I mean by that. So, um, one of the things we experienced with all of the contributors of these essays was, as I said at the beginning of our conversation, the catharsis that they personally experienced in getting a chance to write down, think about, then eventually talk about this special person in their life, who they learned a lot from. In some cases, people were writing about somebody who'd passed away relatively recently, meaning within a months or a couple of years,
Mm,
like in my case. Other people were writing about somebody who died 10, 15,
yeah.
20, 30, 40, 50 years ago in some cases. Yet the level of emotion was the same, the level of
Mm,
catharsis was the same, the level
mm,
of the pride in honoring the person was the
mm,
same. And we even had this experience yesterday. For those who probably don't know, because the book came out on Monday of this week, yesterday we had a book launch event on Zoom, and we had a couple of panels of contributing authors. So there were about a dozen people in total who had contributed various essays to the book who participated in these panels. And the level of emotion, that came
mm,
through in terms of each one of them talking about their special somebody, what they learned, and why they decided to write the essay, what the experience was in writing it, was absolutely amazing
mm,
to me. I mean, I wasn't smart enough, I don't think, to anticipate the,
mhm,
the level of emotion that would be brought forward. And so the emotion is tough because people are, reliving past
mm,
feelings, but it's
mm,
also extremely freeing, it seems, to people to be able to talk about and honor and do it in a transparent way. So I think the valuable lesson here that goes back to the question, the root of the question you were just asking, is, if you're in a leadership role dealing with grief, or if you're a leader, for example, who's dealing with somebody else, who's experienced grief like this on your team, one of the most valuable and impactful things you can do is to allow for expression, a chance to honor the person,
mm,
talk about what you or this other person may have learned from a lost loved one, because A, it's a way of processing the grief, which is important, but B, it's also a way of passing along the teachings and the learnings and the lessons that this person contributed to the world. What a great way to honor whatever that person's leaving behind than to share, with others, what they taught us. So the
mm.
idea of, I'm going to be a tough, strong leader, I'm going to bottle it all up, I'm not going to discuss it, I'm going to come back to work after 2 days of,
Yeah,
bereavement time, and, pretend like nothing traumatizing actually has just occurred, and, soldier on by, running my meetings and acting like everything is okay. There's only so much that you can do to compartmentalize
yeah,
and to bottle things up. It's not really healthy, probably mentally or physically to do that, but maybe even equally importantly, it's denying the world the
Mm,
opportunity to learn something valuable from this person who may have left us, but left behind, a lot of valuable stuff in terms of insights about,
mm,
being a better human being and a better leader. So I think it's better to be open about it than it is to be closed about it. That's a really
mm,
important learning from the book.
mm. No, I really appreciate that, and I want to add to that that what is really important for leaders to recognize is that this is 2025, and this is post-pandemic. I think the
Yeah.
pandemic did something to all of us. And some people have come back and they insist on going back to the good old days because that's
Mm.
how they were brought up, that's how they ascended to their leadership roles or whatever. But the world just doesn't work that way anymore. I mean, I see in myself and in many people that, the days when it was expected that you would bottle up the human being that would show up at the workplace was completely separate and devoid of any emotions or problems at home, or none of that was supposed to come into work, right? You're supposed to go there and just like a good robot, just do your job.
Right.
That is just simply not true. It just doesn't happen that way. I remember getting divorced, and it's a hard experience, and I remember continuing to wear my wedding ring,
Mm.
for a year or two after, just so nobody would find out
Right.
at the
Right.
time when I was most vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I didn't say a word to anyone. I remember at the time I had a clearance, and another good friend of ours, called from the security office. I won't mention names here, but and said, "Hey, Sonia, something changed in your personal life?" And I'm like, what do you mean, Fred? And he said, and he said, you're supposed to report that because you hold this level of clearance.
Right.
And I said, oh, that.
Yeah.
And I'm
Must have
like,
slipped my mind.
it slipped my mind. And I'm like, what? And I confided in him, well, I knew, he was an astounding gentleman. And I said, but I don't want anybody else to know. And he said, well, that's all right. I can not tell others. There's a couple of people I probably have to tell, but we can keep this private. But you do need to let us know.
Yeah, well, it was successful because it took me a while before I learned it. So,
Yeah.
your strategy worked, I think, at that time.
Well, it was just, to me, it was unthinkable that I would, especially being a woman, probably, even though again, I didn't really I was always a tomboy and I didn't particularly think of myself as a woman, but somehow I just felt like that would not be a thing that I should share. Nobody told me I shouldn't, right? I mean, it was just a feeling I had that was not a good thing for me. Um,
Well, we talk a lot, certainly in the HR space and the diversity, equity, and inclusion space about creating environments where people feel comfortable bringing their entire
Full
selves,
self. Yeah.
to
Yeah.
the workplace, and we mean it when we say that, but it's situations like this when you realize how difficult and challenging that can be because you want people to be comfortable enough to bring these kinds of situations, whether it's going through divorce, which is obviously difficult, or losing a loved one and having to process that loss. It's really hard to be as effective as a leader and as a person when you're processing that kind of loss, and particularly when you're bottling it up and hoping that nobody's going to discover that it even happened, than it is to be able to share it with people and use it as a teaching moment, but also as a learning moment. So again, for everybody who's listening to our conversation, I would say, hope you don't have anytime soon the need to process this kind of loss. But if you do, try to teach other people, what you
Mm.
learned from this person who was important to you. And even if you personally have not experienced this kind of loss, just recognize as a leader there are people around you who are carrying around stuff that you just don't even realize, right? And that was probably one of the other really, eye-opening learnings for me as the lead author of this book is all these various people who contributed these great stories and insights to the book, how much they were carrying around that had not necessarily been adequately expressed or shared. And that's why the whole experience has become so cathartic for people, was because it was bottled up in ways that they didn't even realize. And in some cases, for many, many years, this kind of sharing and learning has become freeing. And so, each of us in our own individual way, you don't have to write a book to do this, but just interacting with individuals every day, realizing what they're carrying around and giving them a safe place to be able to express it, is a tremendous service that you can actually do for people.
There's actually a very good related question to that in the Q&A now. Says, as leaders who have faced loss and learned courage through it, how can we help the younger colleagues build resilience without dismissing their uh, between right being authentic and sharing and being more open, but then at the same time being resilient, right? And getting through it and not letting that define who you are going forward.
Yeah, it's a
So how do you
super question, because we're trying to balance these competing priorities of the authenticity on the one side and the resilience of dealing with difficult stuff on the other side. Here's kind of how I see it, not only from the experience of writing the book, but just dealing with a lot of leaders at all kinds of stages of life in my own business. One of the things that really matters a lot is causing people to feel like they can express themselves, right? And whether it's whether what they're about to share is popular or unpopular, it's what they think and how they feel. And if you can create an environment that gives people a chance to say it, express it, clarify it, maybe refine it over time after they get over some of the initial emotion. What I think ends up happening as a result of that is you end up with better, more clear decision making, but you
Mhm.
also end up with better resilience because people recognize that not everything they say or want to do is going to be met with enthusiasm and acceptance. They themselves may get criticism or pushback for whatever their point of view is. That's equally important to getting reinforcement and positivity and receptivity to whatever they say. So if you want to build resilience in, younger up and coming people in their careers, I think you have to give them an equal dose of,
Mhm.
enthusiastic support and
Mhm.
realistic pushback or challenge, because you have to get practiced at, dealing with both of those things. One of the hardest things I found, I learned this from teaching a bunch of MBA students in a course over the course of the last couple of years, most of whom are in their early to mid 20s, I would say, where with all due respect, resilience probably is not one of the top characteristics that you would describe this cadre of people to have. One of the toughest reasons I think that's the case is because they haven't had a whole lot of pushback
Mhm.
or direct feedback, not only about what they're great at, that usually they like to hear that, but the things that they're not as great at. And so I think we're doing people a disservice
Mhm.
by not presenting both sides of the story. I think you get more resilient when you're forced to deal with both sides of the story, the positive response as well as the negative response or disagreement, and that just takes practice.
That is such a great point, especially today, again, Ian, because in a world where everybody has access to a lot of information and a lot of ways to communicate, you know, um, this idea of not letting people say what's on their mind, right, is just any way you think about it, it's just not going to serve you well because people's awareness, people's connectedness is just at a level where it's going to come out one way or another. It's going to hurt you. You just won't know what hurt you. I always tell people we have a tool in our newest tool, which is called Trivi, and it's really intended to let people anonymously, if they wish, or however else, with just these like flash pulses or, micro surveys, whatever you want to call them. Just very quickly ask them, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Or they can originate it, right? And then there is all kinds of findings, key insights, key findings, and actions that comes out of that for leaders. And sometimes people tell me, not that often, but once in a while, because we're built for really designed to really help the underserved workforce, the frontline employees,
Mhm.
because they're often, they don't have emails, they don't have desktop devices. So when you do a survey, guess what? I mean, most of the time, the population that's hourly or, non-exempt or, unionized, I mean, that population is left out of most things. And so
Right.
there's good reason why there's high turnover and all kinds of other issues there. So this population, first you have to get their trust, of course, so it has to be anonymous and everything. But a lot of times people go, but we've never asked them. What if they say something really horrible? And I'm like, they certainly, some of them are saying something very horrible. What if you never know? I mean, that's the bigger issue, right? Because you don't know what you're dealing with. And to your point, when that comes out and you can deal with it, after I left Northrop and I went to GD, I got very close with our union population and to the point where, and my boss at the time came into my office once and said, I hear you talk to these guys a lot. Are you just like overdoing it? I'm like, and I said, honey, you've underdone it so long that I think my overdoing it for however long it will be will not make up for that. And then out of that came such good things. And when we needed to in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we needed the union to work differently and do all kinds of things that were outside their contract because we had that relationship. They agreed to do those things that some of my best friends are still to this day are people from that time when we were able to feel things, into theater in like 15 months instead of 4 years. And frankly, I totally, my hat is really off to, I say it again today, General Dynamics, land systems, unionized population that made that possible and saved many lives in that period when we were in two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we needed to upgrade the vehicles so our young men and women wouldn't be blown up. So there is really just power in asking people, to your point, and then dealing with it. And there's things they told us, and we just said no. I mean, to your point.
Well,
But
I'm a firm believer, based on my own experience in life, and I think it's very similar to yours, and that is, if you ask people questions, if you actively seek the truth, like, what's working, what's not working well, what's getting in your way, how can we make, your life and job easier, maybe you have a 51% chance of people telling you the truth and reality. If you don't ask, you have almost a 0% chance of people actually telling you what's going on. And whether you like what they tell you or you don't like what they tell you, I think you have a much higher chance of being successful in dealing with issues and problems, both in life and in the workplace, if you ask and you give people the opportunity to say what's working as well as what's not working, then if you don't ask, bury your head in the sand, hope that it's all going to work out just fine, and somehow convince yourself that if they're not telling you something is broken, that maybe means that something's not broken. In reality, almost everything's broken. It's just a question of where is it broken? Can it be fixed? And what are the actions we can take to fix it? It's much better to know what's broken and where it's broken in order to be able to address it.
100%, 100%. Hey, and I'm going to show the SHRM recertification code here for a moment, just because
Yeah.
we got to do that. We're within a couple of minutes. I can't believe how fast this hour has gone. I could talk to you for another hour. But meanwhile, as people are taking advantage of this code, and for those who like to have it, I want to ask you the last question. What is one practical thing you want to leave with leaders that are listening today, or then later on to our recording, that they can do today, tomorrow, and that can help their workforce in regards to everything that we've talked about?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to just maybe steal from what we were just talking about because that's really kind of where I think the whole conversation was headed. We started at the beginning of the conversation talking about one of the big learnings from this book was, face reality and deal with it, right? And so, you as a leader, anybody who's listening into this conversation can start, today or tomorrow, going to people who you work with and asking questions like, what's working well, what's not working as well, what's getting in your way, how can I contribute to making your life or job easier? And if you ask those questions repeatedly, not just once, but repeatedly over and over again over the coming days and weeks and months, I think you will be amazed what people will tell you, and you will learn stuff about what's working well and not working well that will shock you in a way because they've always been working well and not working well. You just didn't know because you didn't ask. So I would spend the energy on that, see what you learn, and then challenge yourself. You won't be able to fix everything, but challenge yourself to address some of the things that you can get your arms around. If you do that successfully, people will think you're a hero because somebody finally asked them and then somebody finally did something about it. And if that person can be you, you can make an enormous difference that way.
I love what you said. I mean, it starts with that. It starts with the data. You got to get the real data. Some leaders will say, oh, but I have 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 people. How do I do that? Listen, there's tools out there. There's many tools out there. We happen to have the best one. I didn't plan it this way, but I have to say, so get in touch with us if you really don't know how to do this. But what Ian is saying, bottom line is you got to connect with people and ask them and listen to them and face that reality. Can't thank you enough, Ian. Really, really appreciate it. I know the book is going to be a great success. I can't wait to see more of these conversations. You've started something, you've just unleashed something, I think, and that we're all gonna, this is your legacy. I thought you had many legacies before, but this is a legacy. I appreciate it. We tried to finish on time. Thank you so much, and talk to you again soon.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Sonia. Bye
Thank,
bye.
bye-bye.